Thank
Thank
you
you.
for having me. The research I'm presenting today is sort of a love letter to Black Oaklanders who wrestled with internalized racism when institutionalized and structural racism was so pervasive it was in the air they breathed and the ground that they walked on. My work focuses on the relationship between race, class, housing, and access to green space in Oakland, California from 1937 to 2020. Because of this long historical view, I was able to identify reoccurring patterns in which low-income residents, communities of color, and particularly African American citizens were habitually excluded from and dispossessed of home ownership, quality housing, and healthy green environments, while also having their housing, neighborhoods, and lives compromised by environmental harms. I've connected these patterns into three distinct eras: 1937 to 1968, when Oakland was a legally segregated city; 1977 to 1999, when Oakland was a chocolate city; and 2005 to 2020, when Oakland adopted an environmental agenda and started to recognize itself as a top green city, and this era is still unfolding. In 1937, the Hulk security grades codified the bifurcation of Oakland into differently valued landscapes. The hills became the location of the most desirable neighborhoods, and the flats were the neighborhoods declining in value and the least desirable neighborhoods. The Hulk indicated which neighborhood environments and residents were worthy of investment and which were not. This distinction between the hills and the flats is still recognized today. Within the Hulk area description documents, the hill neighborhoods are touted as good, inspiring, and/or unsurpassed, with pretty tree-lined streets and good climate. One of these neighborhoods was considered one of the best residential areas in East Bay, with others described as a beautiful sylvan setting among pine and eucalyptus trees, or as a wooded dell with hillside and forest background. These neighborhoods are situated next to the 500-acre Joaquin Miller Park, acquired by the city of Oakland in 1917, and Redwood Regional, an 1,800-acre forest. In 1934, the Regional Park District was created, aided by a federal appropriation of $500,000. When adjusted for inflation, this translates to approximately $10 million in environmental investments today. The Hill housing tracts had high racial restrictions. They enacted race-based restrictive covenants with protective provisions against occupancy by African Americans and Asians. These neighborhoods all benefited from Federal Housing Administration investments, providing low-cost, long-term loans, which was documented to be cheaper than fair ordinary rent. These neighborhoods represent a scarce and coveted commodity, and property ownership made possible through government loans and in neighborhood investments, which created access to the surrounding green amenities. The suburbanization process also granted these residents a backyard, privatized green space for personal enjoyment afforded by home ownership. The backyard made these residents less dependent on municipal public parks for their access to green space. This is in direct contrast to the neighborhoods in the Oakland Flats. These neighborhoods are described as within walking distance to local industry for laborers, which was actually recorded as under favorable influences. These neighborhoods reveal the intersection of economic advantages through employment and environmental disadvantages amongst housing options for African American and Asian residents. As early as 1937, these neighborhoods are described as having odors from factories, odors from bay flats, smoke and grime from railroad shops and local industry, as well as consisting of cheap older homes zoned for multiple dwellings with no restrictions in regards to residential racial stipulations, with an infiltration of African American and Asians. It is also noted that city taxes were too high in proportion to income and value of these homes. None of the neighborhoods in the Oakland Flats document any green amenities. By 1942, Oakland had approximately 48 public parks and playgrounds. DeFemery Park and Recreation Center in West Oakland became the sole recreation space for Black USO officers to congregate. In addition, African Americans were often denied access to the great outdoors when national parks and regional park systems were legally segregated prior to 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Hoke upheld and solidified racially segregated housing practices and created distinct landscapes in differently valued neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration, along with other federal, state, and local governments, helped to fund the process, and together they created the necessary conditions needed to disinvest and devalue the neighborhoods in the flats of Oakland, clearing the way through demolition using eminent domain for urban renewal projects of the 1940s and 50s, the creation of the federal highway system, and the Bay Area rapid transit system a decade later. The legacy of the Hulk risk grades evaluation system is associated with current neighborhood racial residential patterns, poverty, income inequality, tree canopy, higher ambient temperatures, locations of hazardous waste facilities and Superfund sites, and the lack of green space, parks, and biodiversity. The Hulk system captured, contained, and contaminated these communities for generations. In the next era, 1977 to 1999, Oakland's population transitioned from a white majority to an African American plurality due to white flight to neighboring suburban municipalities. During this time, neighborhoods in the flats of Oakland saw a second wave of new parks, most associated with freeway construction. The remaining undeveloped lands from the freeway construction were acquired and used as sites for park creation. While the number of city parks increased dramatically during this period, the total park acreage increased only slightly. Both new and historical parks within these neighborhoods were now situated under or near freeways, exposing these communities to a new set of environmental harms from traffic-related air pollution. According to the Health Effects Institute panel and corroborated with the Mayo Clinic, place the highest pollution levels between 300 and 500 meters from a road, and it advises to avoid these kinds of areas when exercising. In the historically African American district of West Oakland and prior to 1989, all the parks were located within 500 meters of a freeway, with most of the parks being acquired during and after freeway construction and dedicated as municipal parks and our recreation centers. Only due to the Cypress Viaduct freeway collapse in 1989 due to the Loma Prieta earthquake, all the parks except for three, DeFemery, Wade Johnson, and McClimate's Mini Park, are still in the air pollution exposure zone due to the remaining freeways that encircle West Oakland. This pattern is echoed in the Chinatown downtown district. All 5 parks are within the exposure zone of 1 or more freeways. East Oakland in particular is a park-poor area and lacking in overall green spaces. Most of these parks are located within I-880's hazardous air exposure zone. These new municipal parks did not mitigate the green space deficit between the hills and the flats. The predominantly white residents of the Oakland Hills still live in a suburban aesthetic of tree-lined streets, thick with green spaces and nestled amongst the Joaquin Miller Park, described as the urban wildlands, and Redwood Regional Park, said to be peaceful groves. In 1992, while Oakland was a chocolate city, it began to enact its environmental agenda. And in 1996 and 1998, the city of Oakland adopted 2 environmental initiatives, modeled from the 1992 Earth Summit Agenda 21 and 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which brought cities to the forefront and recognized urban areas as essential to creating a healthy environment and committed the state properties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What emerged was the concept of the Green City, improved an urban area designed to advance sustainable goals, address climate change, improve quality of life, and minimize negative environmental impacts. A crucial part of creating a green city is the production of green spaces, parks, gardens, and urban agriculture. Green spaces absorb CO2 and air pollutants, reduce flooding from stormwater runoff, mitigates urban heat island effect, and can serve as areas for recreation, food production, wildlife habitat formation, and social cultural production and placemaking. The promise of the Green City is particularly vital for low-income neighborhoods and communities of color who tend to be the most environmentally compromised and are less likely to live next to or have access to healthy green spaces. There are 2 parts to creating the Green City. Part 1 is financial and includes the business practice of investing energy products and services in low-income minority and disabled communities. Part 2 is environmental and involves the creation of large areas of land with a mix of uses that are in some combination of public-private ownership but are managed for public purposes such as recreation, ecological preservation, and maintenance of scenic vistas. Between 1992 and taking effect in 2005, the City of Oakland began to erode the amount of affordable housing and low-income housing stock while simultaneously creating the foundation in which Oakland revisioned itself as a green city. The Hope 6 program contributed to the removal of more than 4,000 low-income housing units in Oakland between 1992 and 2018 by placing public housing into the rental market using a voucher aid program. This coincided with the Great Recession and the subprime mortgage crisis, in which California was amongst one of the states hardest hit. African American and Latinx communities in California were disproportionately affected by the crisis because they also had been targeted by subprime predatory lending institutions at twice the rates of whites. During this time, a proliferation of master plans in which green space creation was coupled with luxury housing development. These master plans and specific plans rendered green gentrification and erased African American residents and misrepresented the actual demographic of the neighborhoods they were depicting. Developers and landlords also benefited from millions of dollars in EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, brownfield mitigation project grants used to remove high levels of lead contamination in the soil in the flats of Oakland, in predominantly African American neighborhoods, and removing this population through eviction, raising the cost of living, and spurring on gentrification. What is taking place now is not only green gentrification through displacement, but green gentrification through exclusion, in which government funds and tax incentives made these environmentally remediated housing plus park developments possible while economically excluding the populations that need it the most. This is not just in Oakland. This has happened in San Francisco's Hunters Point, in Chicago and their rollout of green roofs, in Birmingham, Alabama with Railroad Park and the New York High Line, and that's just to name a few. In all three eras, from 1937 to 2020, African Americans particularly have been habitually excluded from and dispossessed of property ownership, quality housing, and green space amenities while having their housing, neighborhoods, and lives compromised by environmental harms and repeatedly sacrificed, benefiting the municipality and its white residents. And I will conclude it there.